On this occasion, we will present a real historical event in China, with its president Mao Zedong in the design of applicable policies in his country in 1958. It is impressive what we can learn when we tell the story with one foot pointing towards the future. To do this, we will use system dynamics, systemic thinking, modeling, and simulation. We will divide this illustration into 5 stages. In the first one, we'll present a small video of 1 minute 41 seconds where the story is told step by step. Then, we will review how we could build a model of this short story. We will see step by step how the structure underlying the phenomenon that has already occurred was visionary. Then, we will go to the dashboard, and there we'll verify stage by stage the consequences that the intervention of President Mao had. Finally, we will design new policies that help reverse the decisions that have already been made, the intentional and unintended consequences that happened because of these decisions, and finally, we'll pass on to its history. As a second stage of this presentation, we will show a video with subtitles in English and Spanish that will allow us to review step by step the decisions that President Mao made, the intentional and unintended consequences it had on its ecosystem, the connections between seemingly separate things, and how economic, social, and ecological issues go together. The decision that was made will affect those 3 major areas. Now, we go straight to the video to learn a lot from this story. From this presentation, how to build a simulation model based on the story we just heard in this video. To do this, let's move on to the storytelling to tell the story step by step. To build a simulation model, the first thing to do is to visualize the sectors that are behind, that underline that phenomenon or that history. In this case, we have the sparrow sector, which is in the upper left corner. Below, we have the crops, grains, sorghum, and corn. Above the middle part, we have the fumigation sector. When trying to kill insects, it is fumigated. Next, we have the sector of insects that are malignant, which are here in the middle. We have the human population that eats grain and also can feed on the fruits. This is the sector here in the lower right. There are also benign insects, pollinators, and above, we have a sector to simplify how we see the story by taking out two performance indicators, the economic part and the ecosystem welfare part. So, these are the sectors seen from above, and here the story is being propped up with photographs. The first thing to see is the stocks or bathtubs, flows, and some basic variables that count the population dynamics or the growth of sowings or sparrows. Finally, there it is. For each of the sectors, there are stocks or bathtubs, flows, and some variables such as times or some small feedback processes. We'll begin by visualizing which are the cause effect cycles that connect the sparrows with the sowing, with the beans. The first feedback cycle is born or displays here. There are two types. Some are balancing loops, which will indicate with a P and a number, and others are reinforcement loops, which will indicate with an R and a number. This is read like this. If I stop at sparrows and say, if the sparrows increase, what happens to planting with the sowing grains? As sparrows eat planting grains, then it means that sparrows decrease. Here is a negative sign. The sowing decreases because they eat it. Then I stop at the planting and say, if the planting increases, what happens to the sparrows? In this case, if there are more grains, then there will be more sparrows because they feed better. In the end, we have the positive and negative signs that are in each of these cycles. For example, from sparrows to grains there is a negative, but from grains to sparrows there is a positive. Two positives. There are three positives. We count the negative numbers, and if it is an odd number, it means that it is of the balancing type. Therefore, here the cycle B1 is identified. Balancing feedback, the first loop. Let's continue. Sparrows do not only eat grains, they also eat insects. Normally, they are the insects that live in that type of sowing. They can also eat insects that are pollinators or benign, but those are elsewhere. They are in the fruit plantations. So, here too, we count the signs. The greater the number of sparrows, the insects decrease, and the greater the number of insects, the sparrows increase. Therefore, there is a negative sign in that cycle. Therefore, it is odd, and here the B2 cycle is born because there is a not negative feedback. Let's continue. In the same way, insects feed on crops. So, if there are more insects, crops decrease. Here is a negative sign, the grain harvest. And if there are more grains, the insects increase. Here is a positive sign. If we add them, it gives us a not number, a not negative number. Therefore, the B3 cycle is born here, between insects and grains. There are other cycles that can be distinguished. For example, insects also transmit diseases to humans, and they can be identified here. If we follow up on the new cycles that arise, we can see that there are two cycles involved here. One is a balancing feedback, B4, and another is a reinforcement feedback, R1. If we add the negative signs, we can distinguish that maybe R1 is composed not only of a single negative sign, but perhaps of 3 or 4 of an even number. If the negative number is even, and if we are careful and add the negative numbers that exist to reach this R1, we will realize that there are several with a negative sign, but they are even. Therefore, if it's even, it is said to be feedback R1. And if we follow the other routes that led me to visualize the B4 cycle, it means that the number of negatives is odd. Therefore, a B4 feedback cycle is born. Then, insects do not only eat crops, but they also transmit diseases to animals or to humans. They transmit pests. Let's continue. Similarly, humans feed on fruits. Therefore, another cycle is born here, the B5 cycle, because there is a negative sign and it is odd. It is 1, so it is odd. Therefore, B5 is born. Before seeing the fumigation, here between pollinating insects and fruits, a new feedback cycle emerges, which we will call R2. This means that there are negative pairs. Therefore, it gives a reinforcement cycle R2. Next comes the fumigation sector. President Mao, once he started eliminating sparrows, caused a disaster. Because the insects grew, he then fumigated, and fumigation does not distinguish between good insects and bad insects. It kills every insect equally. Therefore, the fumigation has its direct impact on insects that cause pests and on insects that are beneficial, like the ones that pollinate. Finally, to simplify the reading of the results of that story, we have a sector where we calculate the performance indicators of that ecosystem. And there we talk about economic and ecosystem health. So here there are all the variables that affect each of these indicators, so that later, in an easy way, when making a decision, we can read if the decision was really correct in a simple way. This is so we don't have to read a lot of variables at the same time. Finally, there is the full story. This is known by the name of structure. It is said that every phenomenon, every system, behind it lies a structure of cause-effect cycles. The educational system of our countries have not prepared us to visualize this. Normally, we walk blindly to the structures that underline every phenomenon. It is also said that structures are the cause or those that determine the performance of a system. So, if I do not know them, it will be very difficult for me to achieve a good result. It is critical to raise to the surface the structure that underlies a system. In this case, it is the structure of the interventions that President Mao had in China in 1958. Then we will move on to simulate it to realize if this really determines the behavior of what we already know happened. Here ends the storytelling stage. Thank you. Fourth stage of this presentation, Learning Lab. Here is a dashboard through which we'll explain the different stages of the decisions that President Mao made in China in 1958. The first stage lasted 4 years, therefore ended in 1962, and he made the decision to exterminate for him the plague of sparrows, and he achieved it. Sparrows is the orange line. Here are the sparrows. He made the decision in 1968, and in 4 years he practically exterminated them from many places in China. The crops, which is the line here, increased, but the insects also increased. Incredible as it seemed, the population suffered famine and began to go down. Millions died. Who would think that removing sparrows was connected to people's food? And that in the end was going to cause famine. Upon realizing it, he later wanted to exterminate the pest through insects. To achieve this, he used insecticides largely. Here it is. In the following years, 1962 to 1966, he killed all insects. It didn't matter if they were benign insects that helped the plantations. Here clearly is what happened. When the insects decreased again, then the food goes up. The sparrows are still down, but the population was already falling sharply. Besides, as the insects grew enormously, the population decreased due to pandemics, due to diseases. Afterwards, he had to import sparrows. In 1966, he shamefully imported sparrows from Russia. Here are the imported sparrows. Well, again, the harvest came back up. But if you realize, it was until then that the population began to rise very slowly. If we review what happened next with the fruit plantations, which were very good until 1966 when the insects were killed. Therefore, pollination fell. From 1965 onwards, they had to implement pollination with people, human pollination. So here you can see that there is a rebound, but it will never be as it was in previous years. The damage was already done. The interventions were extremely disastrous. Very good, up to this point. Fifth stage of this presentation. Once a system has been intervened without knowing what is the structure that underlies that system, it is very difficult to know if the decisions taken are going to give good results or not. Since every system behaves in a counterintuitive way, that is, intuition is of little use. We saw here as something that apparently is not connected with people, like killing sparrows, caused a tremendous famine in which millions of Chinese people died at that time. Once that started, look at this graph, the great imbalance it caused for their country. And this was real. The world saw it. What do we have to do to reverse the course of the history of the disaster that was caused? Well, now we will go into designing new policies to see if we can reverse these dramatic changes that occurred. Here are 3 policies that can be designed, and then we will see if that changes the course of the story or not, or how good they are from the point of view of sustainability. All of them. For example, if I do something to make people's birth rate grow, this costs millions of dollars. It implies perhaps creating more hospitals, more doctors, nurses, medicines, vaccination, care for single mothers, etc. Let's think that I want to implement that policy right now so that the population increases by 20%, and I want to implement it in the 64 once I saw the disaster that was caused. We run the simulation, and here you can see what happens. As you can realize, practically the system did have a small change. In the end, the population increased, but it increased very little, not as it was in 1958. What happens if I now also influence life expectancy to grow 20%, starting the year 1964, for example? It means maybe taking care of the adult people, the old people, medical care, vaccination, but all social issues. Although it costs a lot, I simply run it here and I see the impact of my decision. As you can see, it really affects if the population grows, but not as before. What if I now also buy land from other countries to increase crops? I run it, and as you can see, there are changes, but it's very difficult to change something that already started or that already destabilized the economy of an ecosystem or the health of the ecosystem. So, now you can see how complicated it is. I can make a decision very easy, as is done today in our countries. And many of them without even knowing all the connections that underlie that phenomenon. Just imagine the danger of operating in that way, as many of our countries do. Very good. Thank you. We'll pass to the last stage, the conclusions. Final part of this presentation, conclusions. There is a question that is extremely critical when you want to intervene any system of any kind. All are extremely complex. First of all, the structure underlying that phenomenon or that system must be brought to the surface, and by that, I mean knowing all the interconnections of cause-effect cycles that underlie that phenomenon. If you do not know, it will be very difficult to correctly design good policies that lead the desired end result on the path of sustainability. In general, blind decisions are made in organizations and many governments around the world. They might know some connections, but not all of them, and we have generally seen that there is very little modeling and simulation of phenomena at country level. This is applicable to organizations of any kind, local or state governments, or peace agendas for a country. We must not forget that the structure determines the behavior. For systemic modeling, data is not even needed. What matters is to visualize the structure that determines a behavior, which maps the observed pattern of real behaviors of a system. If that is not known, you will be walking blindly. It will be very difficult to get it right. It will be very difficult to design sustainable policies. Thank you very much. See you next time.